Hi, AP Stats. We're going to go through our course and just do a really quick review. I'm using a new tablet and it's probably not going to be very smooth, so forgive me for anything I have to write, but we will just do our best. So here is a list of the quizzes and tests you have taken this year, semester 1, semester 2, test quizzes. Of course, if you have those home with you, that's great. You can then use them to review. If you don't stress. I wouldn't say that going over your tests and quizzes is maybe the best way to study for the AP exam. However, it couldn't hurt if you want to just go flip back, look over the content. One small note I would make is that the 10.1, 10.2 quiz and chapter 10 test, those were the ones that were taken on my DSHA, so you would find those there. And then chapter 9, chapter 9 was a paper, so not a test. And then chapter 9 quiz, remember, was vocare, so not many seniors took that. Anyway, like I said, if you want to go through your tests and quizzes, that's not a bad thing. It just probably wouldn't be the most, let's say, helpful because of the way that this exam is going to be run. So we're actually going to skip ahead to that first, looking at the AP exam format for this year, which hopefully you've heard a little bit about, but if you haven't, this would be a really good thing to listen to right now. So this year's format for the exam. The first thing is that the date is slightly changing for us. It is Friday, May 22nd, and it will be at 1 p.m. Now, I have not quite understood exactly how this is going to run for you guys, but on, I believe, April 28th, there's going to be a session where you will get to log in and kind of see what they're going to be asking you to do on the exam. I will give you more information when I hear it. But bottom line is Friday, May 22nd, 1 p.m. is when your exam will be. Your exam is 2 free response questions, and these 2 free response questions are going to draw on multiple areas of content, meaning it's not just going to be a confidence interval. It's going to be a confidence interval where you also do something based around, let's say, a normal curve and a z-score and something. I don't know. They're going to mix up a ton of content areas, which is good. You guys are going to have 2 questions, like we said. You will have 25 minutes. Oops. Oh, goodness. 25 minutes to read and respond to question number 1, and then you'll have 5 minutes to upload that response. Once you have uploaded, you will get question number 2, and you'll have 15 minutes to work on question number 2, with then an additional 5 minutes to upload after that. Once you have uploaded your work for question 1, you are not able to go back to it. So just make sure that you've done everything before continuing, but also remembering you only have 25 minutes for that first question. The first question is slightly longer, which means it will be weighed a little bit more. So it's 55% of your grade versus 45% of the grade. I also know it is going to be on a scale of 1 to 5. However, I am not quite sure how that's going to look for this test yet. This is an open notes test. I mean, there's really no way that they could police otherwise. However, this is kind of important. It's not really going to be helpful for you to just have your, 3 subject notebook that you took notes from our class all year in and just try to flip through that. That's not going to be effective. So I created a document for you. You'll see it on my DSHA. It is still pretty long. It's about 13 pages, which I realize is not super short, but 13 is significantly shorter than whatever you have in your notebook. You do not need to fill this out necessarily, but it might be a helpful tool. You're also allowed a formula sheet. You can definitely use the formula sheet we got at the beginning of the school year. However, if you lost that, I am putting a link on our My DSHA page with the document that the College Board has suggested you use. And then last but not least, a note about calculators. So they told us that none of the questions on this exam will you absolutely need a calculator, which is interesting. Any calculations that they would expect you to do could be done with a paper and pencil. However, a calculator is allowed, so if you have one, definitely use it. Make sure it's charged. If you don't have your graphing calculator at home or you never had one all this year, then just a calculator on your cell phone or your computer or whatever will be fine for any of the computations needed. So it's a small note. Definitely keep your calculator handy if you have it, but if you don't have it, you don't have to stress. If you have questions on this exam format or anything else, please let me know. At this point, I don't have a very good idea of when our final exam will be for this class. It kind of is depending on what Dr. Mansfield tells me about exams, so I promise I will get you more information when I know it. And now we're just going to do a real quick content review of our course. So the first topic was exploring data, and this is chapters 1, 3, and 5. We'll start with just what we did in chapter 1, which was constructing and interpreting graphs. So remember, we looked at what a dot plot was, a stem plot, a histogram, cumulative relative frequency graphs, and then we didn't just make these graphs, but we described them using SOCS, shape, outlier, center, and spread. This is something that you would, honestly, I would bet any money you're going to have to do SOCS at some point on this exam, so please don't forget it. And you might be asked to compare two distributions. So again, shape, outlier, center, and spread, super important. However, when they are asking you to compare, just make sure you actually do compare, meaning use comparative language. Greater than, less than, equal to is different from, all of that kind of stuff. In chapter 1, we also went and looked at summarizing our distributions using statistics. So we talked about shape, outlier, center, and spread just a minute ago. Center, mean, median, mode, spread, range, IQR, standard deviation. This was where we also talked about z-scores and the location of a value in a distribution. So oh my goodness, sorry. Position, which would be percentile. Let's see what else. Bivariate data. So that just means two variable data, which would be our least squares regression lines. And inference based around that. So this is where we had a scatter plot and we made a line of best fit, a least squares regression line. We talked about correlation, or the relationship between these two variables, how closely related they are. We looked at residual plots, which showed us basically, is this model a good fit? Remember, a residual, I'm going to write this over here, residual is equal to the difference between observed and predicted. Sorry that that looks so bad, but hopefully you kind of get the picture. And then last but not least in this section was categorical data. So looking at conditional distributions in two-way tables, bar graphs, which is very much different than a histogram. Make sure you don't get that confused. And that is section 1, topic number 1, exploring data. So this is a lot of early first semester stuff. Next up is sampling and experimentation, and honestly this is really just chapter 4. This section holds the least weight on a typical AP Stats exam. However, because of the difference in this exam, I'm not sure how much it will come up, but this would be something that you probably would want to look over. Specifically, I would say like a lot of this stuff right here. We're going to start though real quick with data collection with sampling methods, different ways to gather our individuals that we want to learn more about. So remember, like a simple random sample, that's good. We can make it better by doing a cluster sample or a stratified random sample. But then of course there are bad ways to sample, like convenience samples and voluntary response samples, things like that. So using all that language is super important. Then we talked about conducting experiments. Well, I guess maybe before we conduct an experiment, we'll talk about sources of bias, things that would influence our data in ways that would not really be good, and making sure we know that if we have identified a source of bias, that our statistics are really not reliable. Anyway, then to conducting experiments. So this was, there was a lot of stuff here, but one thing that this section really asked us to do a lot was identify treatments in the experiment and who is actually receiving those treatments, the subjects if they are humans, or experimental units if they are not. We talked about control, right? Making a group that we can compare it to. We talked about placebo and blinding, double blind as well, and not just one. And this would be where we first learned about matched pairs design, which came back later when we talked about inference, and then blocking, of course, as well. Smaller section, but still a lot of stuff in here that they could get you to answer a quick question about on this exam. The third section was anticipating patterns. So this was a lot of different chapters. We saw anticipating patterns in chapters 2, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 10. Although, well, we'll get to that in a minute. So chapter 2, anticipating patterns, was all about our good friend, the normal distribution. So this was like our normal calculations. And when we first started learning about the empirical rule, or the 68, 95, 99.7 rule. Be very familiar with that. I can imagine it will come up, and that would be something that you wouldn't want to get wrong. It'd be a little embarrassing. The next topic in anticipating patterns that we covered was probability. Oh goodness. This pen is not exactly my friend right now. Anyway, what was I talking about? Probability. All right. So there's a lot in this section. Remember all of your rules, the addition rule, the multiplication rule, our complement rule. What does it mean to be independent? What does it mean to be mutually exclusive? What are some myths about probability, right? It does not mean if I have a 1 out of 2 chance that it will happen if I flip a coin twice. No, it's something in the long run. We also talked about conditional probability in this section, which is linked to independence as well. I would definitely look over your probability notes because I imagine that this is something that will come up on this year's exam. Then at the end of first semester, we looked at random variables. There are 2 main types, binomial random variables and geometric random variables. Oops. Binomial random variables and geometric random variables. We also talked about combining random variables in this chapter. I would also highly recommend you taking some time to review random variables. It'll come up in our review over these weeks, but if you have no idea what I'm saying when I say binomial or geometric, maybe go look at that chapter sooner rather than later. Then last but not least, anticipating patterns, the big one, sampling distributions. So this would be chapters 7, 8, and 10. The sampling distribution of sample means. Oh wait, am I back? Sorry, I think I just clicked something. Okay, see, this little guy is not my friend. Sampling distribution of sample means, sampling distribution of sample proportions. Where am I? Okay, p hat and x bar. The difference in p hat or x bar in terms of what our distribution looks like, what's the mean of that sampling distribution of sample proportions, what's the mean of the sampling distribution of sample means, all of that good stuff. Chi-squared distribution we did not do, so just ignore that, but we did talk about a t distribution. When does that come up? Why did that come up? Make sure you review that. And then last but not least, the biggest section, and definitely something that I would expect them to ask you a question about, statistical inference. So the main 2 topics in statistical inference are confidence intervals and significance tests. In both of these, we have a 4-step process. Sorry, that was really bad. Right, our state plan, do, and conclude. Make sure you remember what to do in each of those steps. Probably have that written next to you if you don't really know it so well. A confidence interval, couple just general things. There's a confidence level. How confident do we want to be? We are making sure we know the difference between a parameter and a statistic. We are trying to estimate a population parameter by using a statistic. And we have done confidence intervals for proportions, means, the difference between proportions or means, and we did not do the slope of a least squares regression line. That was actually chapter 12, which was taken out of this year's exam. Last but not least, significance tests. Again, we have done a lot of different tests. We've done proportions, means, the difference between those proportions or means. Again, we did not do the slope significance test because that was chapter 12 again. And chi-squared is something we did not get to, unfortunately, but that's okay. In significance test, remember, there's a lot of logic behind this. That's why I had you do that paper. A null hypothesis, an alternate hypothesis. There's type 1 and type 2 errors. Right now, I'm just saying a bunch of words. Hopefully, significance tests are pretty fresh in your memory because they were one of the last things we did. And like I said at the beginning of this video, that this is just going to be a real quick review of the semester. I mean, it was 15 minutes, but that was an entire year of AP Stats in 15 minutes. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys soon.